Rhode Island, March 1941. Otto Brandenberger hadn't slept in 36 hours. Under the yellowed light of an industrial lamp, he studied the British plans spread across the drafting table like an incomplete puzzle. The Nissen hut, that corrugated metal cylinder the British had patented in the First World War, was ingenious, yes. But it was also a curved prison where beds pressed against walls that bent inward, where every square inch fought with geometry. The door to the George A. Fuller Company's temporary office opened with a creak. Peter Dejongh entered carrying 2 cups of cold coffee and the weight of a country preparing for war. "How much time do we have?" Otto asked without taking his eyes off the drawings. "Less than you think." Peter set the cups on the table, pushing some papers aside. The Navy called again. They want the first prototype in June, mass production right after. That's 60 days. 58, technically. Otto finally raised his head. His eyes were red, but his mind remained sharp as a blade. He was Fuller's only architect, the only one, and now carried on his shoulders a mission that seemed pulled from a science fiction novel: design a structure that could be sent to any point on the planet, assembled by untrained men, and withstand everything war threw at it: bombs, hurricanes, scorching deserts, Arctic glaciers, all in 60 days. "We need to rethink the art," Otto said, grabbing a pencil and drawing a line over the Nissen design. "Look here. The problem isn't the shape. The shape is perfect. It's where it touches the ground." Peter leaned over the table. He was an engineer, not an architect, but understood structures like one understands one's own skeleton. The walls. Exactly. The Nissen goes straight down to the foundation. It's clean, it's simple, but it wastes space. Otto gestured with his hands as if molding the air. A bed needs a straight wall. A sink needs a straight wall. Anything a human needs to use sits against a vertical surface. So you want to cut the curve. 4 feet of vertical wall on each side, then the arch begins. Otto sketched quickly, and what emerged on paper was something different. Still a semicircle, but now borne on legs. We keep the structural resistance of the arch. We don't mess with the physics, but we gain meters of usable space. Peter took the drawing and carried it to the window, where the natural morning light was beginning to invade the warehouse. March in Rhode Island was still cold, and the vapor from his breath danced in the freezing air, leaking through the cracks. "And the steel?" he asked. "Can Anderson sheet metal bend corrugated sheets at that radius?" "If they can bend for the British, they can bend for us." "The British have patents, Otto. Nissen patented every bolt of that structure. Then we don't use his bolts." Otto smiled for the first time in days, a tired but genuine smile. "We change everything. The rib structure, the fastening system, the internal insulation. We make this ours." It was at that moment that true ingenuity began. The production shed smelled of machine oil and freshly cut metal. On an 840-acre site on the west side of Davisville, Fuller was building a factory while still inventing the product it would manufacture. Otto and Peter didn't work alone. There were welders, metallurgists, carpenters, men who understood materials at the cellular level, who knew how steel behaved under stress, how plywood reacted to moisture. The war hadn't officially reached America yet, but it was already sending urgent messages. Pearl Harbor was 8 months away. "The problem," Otto explained to a group of engineers around a scale prototype, "is that each hut needs to be both unique and identical at the same time." One of the men, a metallurgist from Chicago named Frank, frowned. "That doesn't make any sense." "Yes, it does. Identical in structure. Every rib has to fit any base anywhere in the world, but unique on the inside. The Navy doesn't just want dormitories. They want hospitals, kitchens, chapels, arsenals. 86 different configurations, all using the same steel shell." 86? Frank shook his head in disbelief. "War doesn't wait for you to believe, Frank. It just waits for you to build." And they built. The solution came in the form of radical modularity. The steel ribs, those curved bones that would shape the hut, would all be identical. The difference would be in the plywood front walls and internal configurations. One hut could become an infirmary with the addition of partitions and special bunks. Another, with industrial ovens and counters, transformed into a field bakery. But the real masterstroke was in the ribs. Otto and Peter abandoned the Nissan's T-section in favor of something new. Two steel channels welded back to back, creating a serpentine shape with grooves. These grooves allowed nails to be driven directly into the steel. No need for screws, washers, or specialized tools. 10 men, hand tools, one day, Peter murmured like a mantra. It has to be that. 10 men without training, Otto corrected. The Navy won't have time to teach carpentry in the middle of an invasion. They tested the concept repeatedly, timed every step, adjusted every angle. The first rib took 4 men 2 hours to assemble. The 10th took 20 minutes. In May, the first complete Quonset hut stood. It was 16 feet wide by 36 feet long, 8-foot radius in the arch. Weighed 3.5 tons but could be disassembled into 12 crates that would fit in any cargo ship. The floor was 1-inch tongue and groove plywood, elevated on a metal frame. Between the external corrugated steel and the internal masonite lining was wood fiber insulation. Doors and windows were cut into the plywood ends. There were provisions for a chimney, and most importantly, it could be erected by a team of 10 men in a single working day. "Do we send it to England?" Peter asked, observing the gleaming structure under the May sun. "We send it to England," Otto confirmed, "under Lend-Lease. Let's see if the British approve." The telegram arrived on a rainy Tuesday. Huts arrived, Iceland stop. Performance excellent. Stop urgent request. 500 additional units. Stop. Otto read the message 3 times as if the words might change between readings, and then he handed it to Peter, who read it once and smiled. 58 days, Peter said. "You did in 58 days what should have taken 6 months." "We did," Otto corrected, "and it's not over yet. 500 units are just the beginning. When the war really starts—" He didn't need to finish the sentence. They both knew. Fuller was already negotiating with Strand Steel Corporation to expand production. Other factories would prepare. The demand wouldn't be in the hundreds, but in the tens of thousands. But on that rainy June afternoon, before the world truly caught fire, Otto Brandenberger allowed himself a moment of quiet satisfaction. He looked out the temporary office window, which would soon be demolished to make way for more production lines, and thought about what they had created. It wasn't just a shelter. It was a portable promise of survival, a piece of geometry that said, no matter where you are, no matter what comes, we built something that holds. Outside in the factory courtyard, workers were already beginning to assemble the second batch. The sound of hammers on steel echoed like a prelude, an industrial symphony of preparation for a war that didn't yet have a name, but already had an address, and it had shelter. 60 days. Sometimes that's all history gives you. Otto Brandenberger and Peter Dejongh had used every second. In the summer of 1941, the first Quonset huts crossed the Atlantic. By the end of the war, 170,000 units would be produced. They would house soldiers on 5 continents, withstand typhoons in the Pacific, endure sandstorms in North Africa, and remain standing when masonry buildings around them collapsed. But that would come later. In that June of 1941, they were still just a tested idea, a steel curve that bet that mathematics was stronger than war. And as it would be discovered, mathematics rarely loses. John Mackenzie was 46 years old, with hands that knew wood the way other men know faces. For 23 years, he had been a carpenter in Cedar Rapids, Iowa. He had built barns that withstood tornadoes, houses that kept families warm through cruel winters. His joints were perfect, his squares precise. He knew, by muscular instinct, when a beam was level, just by the sound of the hammer against the nail. Now he was on his knees on an island in the middle of the Pacific, sweating under a sun that turned his steel helmet into a frying pan, assembling something he had never seen before the war, a tin house that folded in half. "Mackenzie, second rib now," Sergeant Boyd shouted above the distant noise of artillery. The Japanese were less than 3 kilometers away, hidden in the dense jungle surrounding Henderson Field. It wasn't a question of if they would attack, but when. John and 9 other Seabees, construction battalion, Seabees, worked as if their lives depended on it. And they did. The 6th Naval Construction Battalion had landed in Guadalcanal 3 days after the Marines took the beach. While the riflemen held the perimeter, the Seabees had a different mission. build the infrastructure of war in real time, runways, fuel depots, field hospitals, and shelter. Always shelter. Williams, pass the rope. John extended his hand without looking, trusting blindly. The calloused hand of Thomas Williams, a 52-year-old plumber from Philadelphia, placed the manila rope in his palm. Together, they hoisted the second steel rib. The Quonset hut had arrived to them in 12 wooden crates, stacked like giant Lego pieces, in the hold of a Liberty cargo ship. The instructions were simple, dangerously simple, so much so that John, the first time he read them, thought it was a joke. 10 men, hand tools, one day. But it wasn't a joke, it was absolute necessity. "Have you seen the British Nissans in Africa?" Boyd had asked during the morning briefing while distributing work orders. "Those tin cans that look like crushed toothpaste tubes?" Some nodded. Most had never left the United States until 6 months ago. Forget them. This is different. He knocked his knuckles on one of the crates. Lighter, faster, smarter. The engineers did their homework. Our mission is to prove they didn't lie. John remembered opening the first crate with a crowbar, revealing sections of corrugated galvanized steel that gleamed like fish scales under the tropical light. They were lighter than he expected, a sheet he could lift alone, though he preferred help. The ribs, however, were the critical part. Each was formed by 2 steel channels welded back to back, creating a strange shape that looked like a flattened metal snake. But those serpentine grooves had a purpose. They accepted nails. Common nails, not screws, not rivets, not special tools that required training, just nails and a hammer. "They designed this thinking of idiots," Williams had said admiringly. "No," John had corrected. "They designed this thinking of carpenters under enemy fire." The first 4 ribs were erected, anchored to the wooden foundation they had prepared the night before. The process was almost meditative when you got into the rhythm. Position the rib, hoist it with the rope tied to the highest point of the arch, guide it to the anchor, bolts, tighten, then came the purlins. Horizontal beams connecting the ribs, stabilizing the structure laterally. John hammered methodically, finding the grooves in the steel, feeling the nail bite and hold. Tock, tock, tock. The sound of the hammer was hypnotic, almost comforting. For a few seconds, he could forget that he was 12,000 kilometers from home, that there was dried blood on the runway they were using as a work area, that at any moment a Japanese Zero could emerge from the clouds. "Tock, tock, tock! Contact!" someone shouted. The sound of hammers stopped instantly. 11 men threw themselves to the ground, 10 Seabees, and Sergeant Boyd. John tasted dirt and diesel oil as he pressed his face against the compacted soil. The engine roar came from the east, a single plane flying low. "It's ours," Boyd shouted after 3 eternal seconds. "P-40, it's ours." They rose slowly, wiping the dirt from their sweat-soaked uniforms. No one said anything. There was no need. They had all thought the same thing. They continued hammering. The corrugated steel sheets climbed up the rib skeleton like skin being stretched over bones. 2 sheets per section, overlapping 6 inches at the edges. The nails pierced the steel and bit into the rib grooves with a satisfying sound, crunch, that said they were secure. Williams worked beside John, his hands moving with precision born from decades of plumbing houses in Pennsylvania. "Have you thought," he said between hammer strikes, "that this is going to become a hospital? Or arsenal or chapel?" John positioned another nail. The sergeant said there are 86 ways to set up the interior. 86? Williams whistled. And I thought plumbing was complicated. It's the same principle, modular system. The shell is always the same, but what you put inside changes everything. Carpenter philosophy. War physics. The conversation was choppy, interrupted by work, but it was important. It kept minds occupied, fears buried. John had learned this in the first days in Guadalcanal. You could think about death or about joints, but not about both at the same time. He chose the joints. The plywood front walls were being screwed on. Unlike the main body, which was all nails, the ends required square head bolts that could be tightened with pliers and a wrench. Nothing that required specialized skill, but that required attention. Doors and windows were already cut into the plywood sheets. They were just symmetrical holes, but they represented something profound, the difference between a box and a dwelling. "Do you think the Japanese have this?" asked Danny Chen, a welder from San Francisco, only 23 years old, the baby of the group. He was positioning one of the windows, making sure it was level. "The Japanese," Boyd responded, observing the work, "dug concrete bunkers underground. We build tin houses in 18 hours, different philosophies. Which works better? The one that keeps more men alive." Boyd looked at the sky, calculating how much daylight remained. "And alive means mobile. A bunker doesn't walk. This here," he knocked on the wall of the nearly complete Quonset, "can be disassembled and relocated 100 kilometers from here next week." John heard but didn't comment. He understood the logic, but he also understood the terror. Concrete seemed solid, permanent, safe. Corrugated steel seemed provisional, fragile, but he had seen wooden barns survive tornadoes that destroyed brick houses. He knew that resistance wasn't always a matter of thickness, but of how you distributed stress. The arch distributed it perfectly. The sun descended like an orange fireball over the Pacific when John hammered the last nail. The Quonset hut was complete, 20 feet wide, 48 feet long, 960 square feet of usable space, plywood floor elevated on a metal frame, insulation between the external steel and internal masonite lining, provisions for a chimney, unnecessary here but essential in Iceland or Alaska, 10 men, hand tools. One day, technically 18 hours. The engineers in Rhode Island hadn't lied. "Inside," Boyd ordered. "Let's see if this tin can hold our weight." They entered, all 11, tight but covered. The interior smelled of fresh wood and new steel. The sunset light leaked through the windows, creating golden stripes on the plywood floor. John stood in the center, looking up. The curve of the ceiling created a strange sensation, not claustrophobic, but intimate, like being inside a metal whale. The ribs were visible, steel bones supporting everything. "Does anyone know how much this can handle?" Danny asked. "In terms of weight or in terms of war?" Williams responded. "Both." Boyd lit a cigarette, probably violating 15 regulations. "The tests in Rhode Island showed it can handle Arctic snow loads. As for war," he took a long drag. "In Iceland, a hurricane tore the roofs off the British niacins. These stayed intact." "And bombs?" John heard his own voice ask the question. Everyone was thinking. "It's not made to take a direct hit. Nothing is except maybe a 3-meter concrete bunker." Boyd looked around. "But it can be buried, covered with dirt and sandbags. Then it can handle nearby explosions, and the shape helps. Where do you think the shock wave will hit?" John visualized mentally. The curvature would make the waves slide, spread out. There would be no corners where pressure would accumulate. "Ingenious," he murmured. "Desperate," Boyd corrected, which looks ingenious in retrospect. Outside, the sound of artillery resumed, more distant now but constant. The Japanese were probing the defenses, as they did every night. Somewhere in the jungle, men were dying, but here inside this steel curve, 11 men were alive, and tomorrow they would build another and another and another, until the entire island was a city of metal semicircles, a temporary metropolis built by farmers and plumbers transformed into soldiers, by carpenters who learned that houses don't need to be square to be homes. 1 month later, the 6th Battalion had erected 43 Quonsets, hospitals where doctors operated under lantern light when generators failed, arsenals stacked to the ceiling with ammunition, kitchens where bakers produced bread for 5,000 men, dormitories where soldiers slept in shifts, always half awake, half unconscious from exhaustion, and a chapel. John never knew who decided they needed a chapel, maybe the chaplain, maybe some officer with a heavy conscience. But when they finished assembling it, something about it seemed different from the others, even empty. It had an echo. Even during the day, it had reverence. "It's the arch," Williams had said, entering behind John. "Cathedrals are arched. There's something in the shape that makes you look up." John looked up. The curved ceiling ascended like hands in prayer. There were no stained glass windows, no ornate pulpit, no carved pews, just plywood, steel, and geometry. But Williams was right. There was holiness in the curve. "Do you think," John asked, that the guys in Rhode Island thought of this? That they were designing cathedrals too? I don't know what they thought. Williams placed his hand on one of the ribs, feeling the metal warmed by the sun. But I know what they built. They built an answer. Answer to what? To the question every war asks. Williams turned to leave, but paused at the door. How do you protect what matters when everything around you's burning? John stood alone in the empty chapel, hearing the distant sound of hammers. Another Quonset going up. Always another. Outside, the war continued. Inside, men built. And the difference between building and destroying, John realized, was the same difference between an arch and a rifle barrel. Both were made of metal, but only one sheltered you from the rain. Between 1942 and 1945, the Seabees would build 111 main runways, 441 piers, 700 blocks of warehouses and housing for 1.5 million men in the Pacific. More than 200 Seabees would die in combat. 2,000 would receive Purple Hearts. But in September 1942 in Guadalcanal, all that mattered was the next nail, the next rib, the next steel semicircle that said, here you can rest, here you can heal. Here for a day or a night you are home. 10 men, 1 day, 1 house. Every war is made of numbers. But sometimes numbers build hope. The wind arrived like a living entity. It wasn't a gust or a strong breeze. It was a furious creature that bit metal and tore out hopes. Lieutenant Commander Harold Benson felt the first assault at 9:34 p.m. when the door to his provisional office was sucked out of its hinges with a crack that sounded like a rifle shot. He was reviewing supply reports when it happened. 3 seconds later, he was on all fours on the floor, holding onto the table leg while papers flew like frightened birds exiting through the opening where a door had been. Everyone to the shelters, someone shouted outside, the voice almost swallowed by the roar. Now! Now! Harold looked through the window, or what remained of it, and saw the apocalypse. The naval base in Reykjavik was being torn apart. The weather forecast had been clear. Storm approaching, winds up to 110 kilometers per hour, maybe more. Tie down everything that can fly, the operations officer had instructed during the afternoon briefing, and pray for the PBYs. The PBY Catalinas, those patrol seaplanes that were the pride of the base, were anchored on the beach, protected by ropes and weights. They were magnificent machines, wings that could touch 2 oceans, but on the ground, they were vulnerable as babies. Harold had personally supervised the securing of 2 of them, checking every knot, every mooring cable. 20 years of Navy had taught him that storms don't respect ranks. You tied down right or paid in twisted steel. But there was something about that storm that seemed different. The barometer was dropping like a stone in a well. The sky had that yellow-greenish color that Harold associated with tornadoes in Kansas, not Arctic winds in Iceland, and the old Icelandic fishermen, those men who knew the North Atlantic like their own hands, had looked at the horizon and shaken their heads. Ulfur, they said, wolf. Harold didn't speak Icelandic, but he understood the tone. The base had 3 types of structures: permanent masonry building, few; British Nissen huts, many; and the new American Quonset huts, 23 to be exact. Newly arrived via Lend-Lease, still smelling of paint and Rhode Island promises. Harold managed to reach the command bunker, a buried concrete structure that vibrated with each gust but remained solid. Inside, 12 men crowded together, some still wearing soaked uniforms, others only in underwear because they'd been torn from their bunks. "Report!" Harold shouted to Sergeant Morrison, who was holding a dead field phone. "Lines cut, sir. No contact with the north sector. Hangar 3 reports ceiling partially torn off, and the British—" Morrison swallowed hard. "The British are being eviscerated. The Nissens—" "Yes, sir, like sardine cans. The roofing's coming off." Harold closed his eyes. Inside those Nissens slept 80 men. Radar technicians, radio operators, mechanics, men whose only protection against the wolf was a layer of corrugated metal. "And ours?" "The Quonsets?" Morrison checked his notes. "Last communication from the east sector reported solid." That was the word they used, us. Solid. What Harold Benson didn't know, what few knew that night in 1941, was that he was witnessing an unplanned engineering experiment, a test that Otto Brandenberger and Peter Dejongh had intuited but could never replicate in a laboratory. The test of nature against mathematics, the fundamental difference between a niacin hut and a Quonset hut, wasn't just in the vertical walls or superior insulation, it was in load distribution. The niacin was a pure semicircle, elegant, simple, but with a critical problem. All the wind force hit the curvature at a single angle. Without the 4-foot vertical walls, the point where the arch met the ground became a fulcrum of concentrated stress. The Quonset, with its 4-foot walls before the arch began, distributed the load differently. The wind hit the vertical wall first, a surface that could deflect part of the force downward to the foundation. Then the curvature began, deflecting the rest upward and around. It was like the difference between receiving a direct punch and receiving a glancing punch. Both hurt, but only one broke bones. The roar didn't stop. Harold had seen Atlantic storms that flipped warships like a bathtub toys. He had seen 20-meter waves swallowing destroyers. But there was something viscerally terrifying about being buried while the world above was being redrawn by fury. "Sir," a young Lieutenant Carter from Boston, eyes too wide, stumbled into the bunker. Water dripped from him as if he'd swum there. Maybe he had. The PBYs on the beach." Harold waited. "They're gone, sir. All of them. I saw one of them spinning through the air like a hat, just flying." Silence in the bunker. Those planes weighed tons. If the wind could tear them from the ground like paper, what would it do to corrugated metal? And the structures? Harold asked, his voice strangely calm. "The Nissans are losing sheets, sir. I saw men running from the ones that were losing their roofs, but the Quonsets—" Carter shook his head, incredulous. "The Quonsets are holding. I mean, they vibrate like hell, but they're holding." Morrison looked at Harold. "Geometry?" "Geometry," Harold confirmed. "The storm reached its peak between 2 and 3 in the morning. Afterward, eyewitnesses would say it was like being inside an airplane engine. A constant, thunderous sound that erased thought. You couldn't process fear because fear requires mental silence. And there was no silence, just roar." In Quonset Hut 7, designated as a dormitory for 24 men, Specialist 3rd Class Raymond Torres held a crucifix his mother had given him in San Antonio. He wasn't particularly religious, but that night, inside that steel cylinder that vibrated like a violin string, he rediscovered faith. Not in God necessarily, but in engineers. "It's going to hold," someone shouted above the noise. "This thing is going to hold." And it did. The steel sang, a high, piercing tone that made teeth ache. The ribs flexed visibly, curving millimeters inward and then returning. It was terrifying and hypnotic at the same time, like watching a building breathe, but it didn't break. "It's the curve," another man shouted, a mathematician before the war, now a radio operator. "The curve distributes. The force has nowhere to accumulate." The wind died as it had arrived, suddenly, leaving a silence so profound it hurt the ears. Harold Benson was one of the first to exit the bunker. What he saw was calculated devastation. 3 PBY Catalinas had been thrown against rocks, their fuselages crushed, wings broken like dragonfly wings. Another had simply disappeared, probably carried to sea. A 5th was upside down, its tail pointing to the gray sky like an accusing finger. Hangar 3 had lost half its roof, and the British Nissen huts. Harold walked slowly through what remained of the British sector. Of the 18 Nissen structures, only 5 maintained complete roofing. The others were exposed skeletons, the ribs still standing, but the steel sheets torn off, scattered across the field like giant playing cards. Men wandered dazed, blankets over shoulders, staring at where their beds had been. But then Harold reached the American sector. 23 Quonsets, 23 intact structures. There was superficial damage, some dented sheets, a broken window, marks from impacted debris. But the structures remained. The roofs were in place, the doors still closed. Morrison appeared beside him, equally silent. "Sir," he finally said, "I wouldn't have believed it if I hadn't seen it." Harold approached the nearest Quonset, Hut 7, where Raymond Torres and 23 other men had waited for the apocalypse. He placed his hand on the cold steel. It was slightly dented where something large, perhaps a sheet torn from a Nissen, had struck. But the structure was solid. The ribs hadn't yielded. The nails still held. Engineering, Harold murmured. Sir? It's not magic, it's engineering. He knocked on the wall with his knuckles, producing a hollow but firm sound. Someone in Rhode Island did the calculations right. Someone understood load distribution better than the British. Should we report this? Harold thought. Somewhere, probably in a warm office in Washington, supply officers were deciding how many Quonsets to produce, whether it was worth the investment in new technology versus simply licensing the British nonsense. Yes, he said. We'll report. With photos. Lots of photos. Super Typhoon Carrion arrived with winds at 280 kilometers per hour. Guam in 1962 was a city of Quonsets. Thousands of them, built after the island's recapture in 1944, had become the standard urban landscape. Schools, hospitals, homes, all in structures that technically were temporary. But that had been in place for 2 decades. Maria Santos was 11 years old when Karen arrived. She lived with her family in a Quonset converted to a residence. Wooden partition walls, creating 3 bedrooms, an improvised kitchen, a bathroom added to the side. To the center, her father had shouted when the winds began. Away from the windows, they squeezed into the central corridor. Mother, father, 4 children, grandmother. The Quonset groaned around them, a sound Maria would remember for the rest of her life. It wasn't a creak, it was a lament. But it didn't break. Across the island, conventional wooden houses were shattered. Masonry roofs collapsed. Trees became projectiles. The storm was redrawing Guam, but most of the Quonsets remained. Not all, some of the oldest, corroded by salt and years. Lost sheets. 2 collapsed completely, but the vast majority, including Maria's, held. The next day, when the family emerged, they found the neighbor's house, a conventional wooden structure built 2 years earlier, reduced to rubble. The neighbor and his family had taken shelter in one of the community Quonsets and survived. Why? Maria asked her father. Are these tin houses stronger than real houses? Her father looked at the dented but intact semicircle that had protected them. Because, he said slowly, thinking in words a child could understand, they have no corners where the wind can bite. The wind hits and slides, hits and slides. It never can grab hold properly. Maria touched the Quonset's wall, feeling the warmth of steel heated by the post-storm sun. Years later, she would become a civil engineer, and the first project she would design would be inspired by that curve that had saved her. There was a telegram archived in the George A. Fuller Company records, dated November the 18th, 1941, from Naval Base Reykjavik to Fuller Construction. For structural performance, Quonset huts, hurricane category, storm night. 16-17 Nova stop, sustained winds 110 mph gusts to 140 mph stop. British Nissen, structures severely damaged, stop 13 of 18, lost complete roofing, stop American. Quonset structures 23 units, 0 structural failures. Stop superficial damage, only stop request, urgent order. 50 additional units, stop pending cancellation, Nissen. Order stop performance exceeded all expectations. Stop repeat, 0 failures. Stop recommend commendation, project team stop, LTCDR-H Benson. Otto Brandenberger never saw this telegram. He was too busy designing the next iteration, the redesigned hut, with improvements based on field feedback. But Peter Dejongh saw it and kept a copy in his desk drawer, not out of pride, but as a reminder. Engineering isn't abstraction. It's the difference between men sleeping under roofs and men running from steel sheets that fly like guillotines. It's the difference between mathematical intuition and mass funeral. It is sometimes the only thing between humanity and chaos. After the Iceland storm, Quonset orders exploded. The Navy canceled contracts with British suppliers. Production in Rhode Island tripled. The Nissen hut, that elegant invention from the First World War, was slowly abandoned in favor of its more robust American cousin, not because the British were bad engineers, but because the Americans had accidentally discovered something that would take structural engineers decades to formalize. That 4 feet of vertical wall before an arch weren't just a matter of usable space. They were a force dissipator, a storm breaker, A bet that, on a November night in 1941, was tested by winds of 140 miles per hour, and won. The thermometer read 42 degrees below zero when Sergeant Michael Kowalski tried to open the door of Quonset Hut 14. It didn't move. It wasn't locked. It was frozen, sealed by a layer of ice that had formed around the frame during the night. Michael rammed it with his shoulder, once, twice, 3 times. On the 4th attempt, the door yielded with a crack that sounded like a gunshot, and he stumbled inside. The interior was a steel freezer. 6 men were wrapped in bunks, covered by all the blankets they possessed, plus jackets, plus anything that retained heat. Vapor condensed with each exhalation, creating tiny clouds that instantly froze into crystals that fell like artificial snow. "The heater died again," said Corporal Jenkins, his blue lips visible even in the dim light. "At 3 in the morning. Since then, we've been trying not to die." Michael looked at the small oil heater in the corner, a pathetic box that was supposed to heat 960 square feet of space but could barely raise the temperature above freezing when it worked, and now it didn't work. "5th time this month," Jenkins continued, teeth chattering. "If the engineers in Rhode Island thought this would work in the Arctic, they were smoking something really good." Michael didn't respond. He just observed the ice covering the Quonset's inner walls, a thin layer of crystals that gleamed in the weak light, beautiful and lethal. The problem wasn't the structure. It was physics. Steel, for all its virtues, strength, durability, ease of assembly, had a fatal flaw in extreme temperatures. It conducted cold like an Olympic champion. Every rib was a thermal bridge. Every corrugated steel sheet was a heat sink. You could heat the interior as much as you wanted, but the cold outside sucked that heat through the metal like a hungry vampire. And at 42 below zero, the vampire never slept. "We need to talk about the Arctic," Commander Stevens had said, entering Otto Brandenberger's office without knocking. Otto looked up from plans for a new Quonset designed for storage, the so-called elephant hut, 40 by 100 feet of pure space. Problems? Hypothermia, frostbite, men sleeping in 3 layers of clothing because the interior is as cold as the exterior. Stevens threw a report on the desk. Alaska, Iceland, northern Canada, all saying the same thing. The Quonsets are steel freezers. Otto picked up the report, leafed through slowly. He knew the numbers before seeing them. He had done heat transfer calculations during the original design. The problem was that in 1941, the priority was speed and structural resistance. Thermal efficiency was secondary. Now it wasn't anymore. "Isn't the standard insulation enough?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. "Wood fiber between external steel and internal masonite?" Stevens shook his head. "Works in temperate climates. In the Arctic, it's like putting a Band-Aid on a severed artery. So what do you want, more insulation?" "I want steel out of the Arctic." Stevens leaned over the desk. "Or I want an alternative. Wood, maybe. Something that doesn't turn every hut into an ice sculpture inside." Otto was silent for a moment, looking out the window at the shipyard where more Quonsets were being assembled. There was beauty in uniformity, each structure identical, interchangeable, universal. But universality had a price. "Wood," he finally said. "You're suggesting we build wooden Quonsets." "I'm suggesting we let someone build them. We've already proven the concept. Now we need variations." "That goes against the entire design philosophy, standardization, mass production. Philosophy doesn't warm men at 40 below zero, Otto." Stevens took the report back. "And frozen men don't build runways." That conversation marked the beginning of fragmentation, the moment when the Quonset hut stopped being one thing and became many things. Frank Hobbs had never seen a Quonset hut in person when he started redesigning it in wood. But he had seen the problems, field reports from Alaska, northern Canada, Greenland, places where steel froze to the touch, where breath turned to ice, where men preferred sleeping in tents than in superior metal structures. Frank was a mechanical engineer at Pacific Hut, Inc., a small company in Seattle that had just won a $1 million contract with the U.S. Army. 1,000 units, all in wood. The task was simple and impossible at the same time. Maintain the Quonset's shape, that efficient curve that optimized internal space but completely changed the material. Wood doesn't bend like steel, his assistant, a young engineer named Robert, had pointed out. Not without breaking. Then we don't bend it. We segment it, Frank drew quickly. Laminated ribs, multiple layers of wood pressed into curved format like a bridge arch, made of straight pieces that together create a curve. And the covering? Celotex. Frank wrote the word as if it were divine revelation. Waterproof masonite. It's essentially treated pressed cardboard, light, insulating, and doesn't conduct cold like steel. Robert looked at the drawings, then at Frank. You're reinventing the Quonset. No, I'm translating it. Frank tapped the paper. Same grammar, different language. The curve works not because it's steel, but because it's a curve. Physics has no favorites among materials. The resulting Pacific hut, 18.5 feet by 37 feet 4 inches, was strange. It looked like a Quonset that had been reimagined by a drunk carpenter. The ribs were visibly segmented, made of laminated wood strips creating a slightly pointed Gothic arch. The external covering was brown Celotex instead of silver steel, but it worked. More importantly, it didn't freeze. Wood, for all its inferiority in strength compared to steel, had a crucial virtue. It insulated. A wooden wall wasn't a thermal bridge, it was a barrier. Heat stayed inside, cold stayed outside. It looks like a medieval church, Robert had said when they finished the first prototype. It looks like salvation, Frank had corrected. The Alcan Highway, Alaska-Canada Highway, was being built through terrain that God had forgotten to finish. Frozen swamps, forests so dense they blocked the sun, mountains that seemed to laugh at men with machines, and cold. Cold that made 40 below zero seem mild. The workers, a mix of military and civilians, many of them men who had never seen real snow before being sent to the Yukon, lived in camps scattered along the 1,600 kilometers of construction, and slept in Pacific huts. Thomas McAllister, a tractor operator from Arkansas, remembered the first night in one. Felt like we were going to sleep in a giant doghouse, he would say years later. All brown, wood everywhere, that smell of fresh-cut trees. But when you went inside and they lit that little stove in the corner, man, it got warm. Like really warm. The difference was visceral. In the Alaskan steel Quonsets, you could heat the air, but the walls remained freezing. Touch the metal and your skin stuck. In the Pacific huts, the wooden walls absorbed heat and held it. It was the difference between sleeping and surviving, Thomas recalled. In the steel huts, you woke up with ice inside your nose. In the wooden ones, you woke up sweating if you left the stove on all night. But there was a compromise. Wood could insulate, but it didn't have steel strength. A Pacific hut under heavy snow, and snow in the Yukon was very heavy, required constant maintenance. The laminated ribs could crack, the Celotex covering could saturate with water and collapse, and unlike steel, wood burned. The Morrison-Knudsen Company had a different problem. They were building military bases in locations so remote that remote was a euphemism. Jungles in South America, deserts in the Middle East, islands in the Pacific where the soil was literally ground coral. Their men needed shelter, but steel Quonsets were heavy for air transport, and wooden Pacific huts rotted in tropical humidity. The answer was the MK hut, named after the company's initials, MK. Engineer G.D. Paxson, who designed it, had a simple philosophy. The best material's the material you have. So the MK used what was available locally. Laminated wood ribs, like the Pacific, but lighter and more spaced. Covering that could be treated canvas, thin metal sheets, or even woven straw, depending on location. The structure looked like a deformed version of the Quonset. The arch was more pointed, almost Gothic, giving it the silhouette of a medieval church, but it was quick to assemble and adaptable. It's ugly, Paxson had admitted when showing the first prototype to Army officers. But beauty doesn't build roads in jungles. The officer had looked at the MK, then at Paxson. How many men to assemble? 6. Half the standard Quonset. Time? 1 day, maybe less if the crew's good. Weight for air transport? 500 kilos less than the steel Quonset. The officer had signed the contract right there. The Jamesway hut was the logical culmination of adaptation to extreme cold. Designed specifically for Arctic warfare, it was a Quonset taken to the minimalist extreme. Wooden ribs, Insulated canvas covering, 16 by 16 feet, weighed only 545 kilograms, and could be assembled by men wearing gloves. This last characteristic wasn't trivial. Try tightening a bolt at 50 below zero with bare fingers, the designer had explained during the presentation. You have about 30 seconds before you lose sensation. After that, you lose the fingers. So the James Way used large connectors, simple bars, fittings that worked with gloved hands and fingers numbed by cold. When the first experimental battalion used them in Greenland, the reports were almost poetic. Assembly in 2 hours by 4 men using heavy gloves. Interior heated to comfortable temperature in 15 minutes. No ice formed on inner walls. Structure remained stable under 45 mm winds and 18 inches of snow accumulation. Michael Kowalski, the same sergeant who had fought frozen doors in Alaska, was transferred to Greenland in May 1943. His first night in a James Way, he slept without extra layers, without waking every hour shivering, without ice on his beard in the morning. It's strange, he told Corporal Jenkins, who had been transferred with him. It seems fragile. It's just canvas and wood, but it works better than 3 tons of steel. It's because the engineers stopped trying to make one thing serve everything, Jenkins responded, looking around the cozy interior. They finally understood that the Arctic is a different country. It needs its own citizenship. While the North froze, the South melted. In New Guinea, the Philippines, the islands scattered across the Pacific, the steel Quonsets faced a different enemy. Humidity. Not the cutting cold of the Arctic, but the suffocating heat of the tropics, where 100% humidity was normal and steel rusted like wet paper. It feels like someone is using sandpaper on your lungs, a soldier had written in a letter home. And these steel cans are ovens. During the day, you can't touch the walls without burning. At night, everything inside sweats. The walls, the ceiling, your clothes, you. The initial solution was ventilation, more windows. Doors on both ends kept open, elevating the Quonsets on blocks to allow air circulation underneath. But ventilation didn't solve rust. Galvanized steel, treated to resist corrosion, helped but had limits. In a tropical environment where rain was measured in meters per year, the zinc from galvanization was consumed in months. Then came the tropical versions, Quonsets with thicker steel covering, additional anti-corrosive treatment, and in extreme cases, hybrid versions, steel structure but wooden side walls that could be replaced when they rotted. It's Darwinian adaptation applied to architecture, an Army Corps engineer would write in a technical report. The original design survived because it was good enough to evolve. It wasn't perfect. It was adaptable. Otto Brandenberger looked at photographs spread across his desk. Steel Quonsets in Iceland, shiny and solid. Wooden Pacific huts in the Yukon, brown and cozy. MK huts in South American jungles covered with straw. James Way huts in Greenland, white against snow. Tropical versions in the Philippines, elevated on stilts. All descendants of the same original design. All different. Are you seeing this? Peter Dejongh entered, pointing at the photos. Your single design is multiplied into a dozen. It's not my design anymore, Otto said calmly. It never really was, actually. It was just an answer to a question. Now other engineers are asking different questions. And you're okay with that? With people changing your work? Otto picked up the photo of a Pacific hut. He studied the laminated wood, ribs, the pointed roof, the fundamental difference from his original design. You know what this tells me, he finally responded? That we got the basic principle right. The curve works. The arch distributes load. The shape is efficient. These are universal truths. He pointed to the different variations. The materials are just local vocabulary. Engineer philosophy. Engineer humility. Otto smiled. I designed for metal because it was what we had, what was fast, but the real genius, if there is any, is in the shape, not the material. And shapes don't have egos. Peter looked at the photos again, seeing them differently now. So you're saying that all of these, the Pacific, the MK, the James Way, are all Quonsets? They're all answers, Otto corrected. To the same fundamental problem, how do you protect humans from hostile environments using minimal resources and time? He touched each photo. Steel in moderate conditions, wooden extremes, hybrids where necessary. The question changes with geography. The answer adapts. When the war ended, the various hut designs were evaluated for civilian use. The steel Quonset won in most cases. Durable, familiar, mass-producible. Tens of thousands were sold as surplus to veterans, farmers, small businesses. But in extreme regions, the variations survived. In Alaska, wooden Pacific huts remained as hunting cabins and storage. In Arctic military bases, Jamesway huts continued in use until the 1980s. And the lesson, that good design is adaptable design, was absorbed by the next generation of engineers. When modern architects began designing structures for Mars or for the ocean floor, they studied not just the original Quonset, but its mutations. Because the true genius wasn't in creating the perfect structure. It was in creating the structure that allowed itself to be perfected. The steel Quonset hut would produce 170,000 units during the war. The wooden Pacific hut would produce several thousand. The MK, hundreds. The Jamesway, enough to equip Arctic operations for decades. But numbers don't tell the complete story. The story is that engineers in 1941 created not a product, but a template, a concept that said, here's the shape, now fill it with what you have. And through deserts, glaciers, jungles, and islands, engineers filled it. With steel where steel worked, with wood where wood saved, with canvas where canvas sufficed. The curve remained, the material danced, and men survived in both. Robert Chen was 28 years old, had a wife, a 3-month-old baby, and absolutely no place to live. He had returned from Europe in January, Army sergeant. Battle of the Bulge, 2 Bronze Stars that didn't pay rent. Los Angeles was suffocating with 500,000 veterans in the same situation. Men who had saved the world and now couldn't find an apartment. Roger Young Village, the Veterans Housing Administration clerk had said, pushing a form across the counter. Quonset huts, temporary, but it's what we have. Quonset, Robert knew the name. He had slept in some in France, metal barracks that smelled of oil and man's sweat. For families, converted, 2 apartments per unit, 112 acres in Griffith Park, 750 units, 5,000 people. Robert signed without reading. The first impression was desolating. Endless rows of silver metal semicircles arranged in perfect grid like cans on a supermarket shelf. No trees, they had been removed to accommodate more units. No grass, just compacted dirt and gravel paths. It looks like a prisoner camp, Margaret, Robert's wife, murmured when they arrived, but inside someone had tried. A plywood partition separated the 2 apartments. Each side had 480 square feet, tiny bedroom, even smaller kitchen, bathroom shared between units. Masonite walls could be decorated with wallpaper or paint. There were real windows at the ends, and it cost $14 a month. It's ours, Margaret finally said, touching the curved wall. It's not much, but it's ours. Robert quickly learned the realities of Quonset life. In summer, the steel absorbed heat from the California sun. At 2 p.m., the interior reached 40 degrees Celsius. Fans helped, but only spread hot air around. Families slept with doors open, hoping for a breeze. In winter, the small oil heater fought against the metal's thermal conductivity. Waking up meant seeing your own breath condense. There was no acoustic insulation. You heard neighbors arguing, babies crying, life happening through 1/4-inch walls. Privacy was an illusion negotiated, but there was community. Sundays saw families dragging chairs outside, creating improvised villages in the spaces between units. Children ran in mixed packs. Mechanics' kids playing with lawyers' kids, economic geography temporarily suspended by the uniformity of tin shelter. Margaret planted tomatoes and coffee cans outside. Others followed. Soon there were tiny gardens defying the gravel, life insisting through the industrial. The fire started at 3 in the morning. The Quonset in the north sector was divided between the Sullivan and Morrison families. 7 people total, 4 adults, 3 children, a faulty oil heater, a spark, dry masonite. The fire spread through the partition in seconds. There was only one door, war regulation, not civilian housing. The families woke to smoke. The Sullivans got out. The Morrisons didn't. 3 children died. Robert Jr., 6 years old. Patricia, 4. Michael. 2. The parents screamed from outside, trying to kick the metal wall that wouldn't yield. Neighbors arrived with useless fire extinguishers. Firefighters took 12 minutes, an eternity measured in small lives. The city inspected all remaining 616 Quonsets. They installed second exits, improved electrical systems. But the damage was done. Structures designed for temporary soldiers had been forced to be permanent homes, and the conversion had costs measured in funerals. Roger Young Village began emptying in 1950. New construction, Levittown Tracks apartments financed by the GI Bill, offered alternatives. Real houses with straight walls, separate rooms, adequate insulation. Robert and Margaret were among the last to leave in February 1954. They had saved enough for a down payment on a house in Glendale. 2 bedrooms, real yard, 30-year mortgage. On the last day, Robert stood outside the Quonset that had been home for 8 years. He looked at the dented steel curve, the marks where they had hung pictures, the oil stain where the car leaked. "Will you miss it?" Margaret asked. "No," he answered honestly, then paused. "But I won't forget it either. This gave us time to save money, put down roots. It wasn't supposed to be forever." What was it supposed to be? A bridge between war and peace, between having nothing and having something. In June 1954, the last residents left. The Quonsets were disassembled and sold as surplus. Garages, barns, warehouses. The land eventually became the Los Angeles Zoo. No plaque marks that there for 8 years 5,000 people lived in temporary geometry. But they lived, and that in the end was what structures were supposed to do, create space where life could happen, even in tin, especially in tin. Owen Bradley paid $1,200 for a surplus Quonset and transformed it into a recording studio. Not out of nostalgia, he had never served in the war, but because he was broke and that 20 by 48-foot steel semicircle was what fit his budget. The first time he turned on the microphone, something strange happened. The voice came back different. There was no echo in the traditional sense, no ping-pong return from square rooms. Instead, the sound spread through the curve and returned enriched, fuller. The frequencies mixed in ways that audio engineers would take decades to replicate digitally. "It's the arc," Owen would say later. "There are no corners to kill the sound. It circulates, feeds on itself." Patsy Cline recorded Crazy there. Johnny Cash, Ring of Fire. Elvis Presley held sessions. Studio B, as it would become known, would become legendary not despite the Quonset, but because of it. Acoustics that were accidental in Rhode Island found purpose in the Nashville. War had built the instrument. Peace learned to play it. When the earthquake hit magnitude 7.2, modern concrete buildings cracked, but 3 Quonsets built in 1944, 61 years earlier, remained intact. They were relics by then, used for storage by a military base that considered them too obsolete to demolish, too useful to abandon. The steel was corroded, covered with rust like ancient reptile skin, the doors barely closed. But when the earth shook, the ribs flexed. They didn't break. They flexed. Structural engineers came to study. They measured. They calculated. They discovered that the arch's shape, that curve Otto Brandenberger had chosen in 1941 to distribute wind load, also distributed seismic load with accidental elegance. They weren't designed for earthquakes, one wrote in a technical report. But geometry doesn't distinguish between horizontal wind and vertical tremor. Force is force, and arches dissipate force. The Quonsets were photographed, documented, preserved as involuntary examples of resilient design. After the earthquake that killed 230,000, humanitarian aid organizations were looking for rapidly deployable shelters. Someone remembered the Quonsets, the modern structures, made of aluminum instead of steel with advanced insulation, integrated solar panels, carried 1941 DNA. Same curve, same principle of rapid assembly, same philosophy, 10 people, simple tools, one day. Thousands were sent, not as a permanent solution, just as they never were in the war, but as a bridge, time to rebuild, space where life could reorganize. "It's strange," a UN coordinator commented, observing rows of silver semicircles in Port-au-Prince. how war design becomes a peace tool. But it wasn't strange. It was logical. Because war and disaster ask the same question. How do you protect humans when infrastructure collapses? And the answer sometimes is a 70-year-old curve. At Battleship Cove, a 40 by 100-foot Quonset, an elephant hut, houses a World War II PT boat. Visitors enter and stop invariably to look up. There's something about the arch that pulls the gaze. Children ask if it's a church. Veterans recognize it immediately. Touch the ribs like greeting old friends. Architects take photos of the fastening systems, admiring the simplicity. And the PT boat rests in peace under curvature that has known typhoons. Somewhere in Rhode Island, Otto Brandenberger's original plans are archived. Pencil lines on yellowed paper, load calculations, notes in the margins about stress distribution. There's nothing in them that a modern engineer wouldn't recognize because physics has no expiration date. An arch works today as it worked in 1941. Steel distributes load as it always has. Geometry doesn't negotiate with time. 170,000 Quonsets were produced during the war. Most disappeared, melted down, reused, forgotten, but some remain. At military bases in the Arctic, as garages on Midwest farms transformed into homes, churches, studios, silent and functional. They're not monuments. They're tools that forgot to break. And perhaps that's the final lesson. Great design isn't what impresses at the opening ceremony. It's what works in the Second War, in the unexpected earthquake, in the disaster that comes 60 years later. It's design that answers questions that haven't been asked yet. Otto Brandenberger died in 1990 at 91 years old. He never saw Patsy Cline recording in his accidental creation. He never knew that earthquakes would validate his calculations. He never imagined that refugees in 2010 would sleep under curves he drew in 1941. But his mathematics knew, because mathematics is patient, and arches don't care who uses them or when or why. They just hold, and sometimes holding is enough.